Today we've got the Virginia webinar for the EPA Brownfield Grants, and I am Becca Phillips, the Outreach and Education Manager with Mid-Atlantic TAB. Um, Before we kick things off, just want to let you know that we are monitoring the chat if you have any questions come up, and we'll get those answered either live on screen during a question break or in the chat. And we'll also be sending out a link to the recording and slides after the webinar later this week. So feel free to keep that chat going. Love to kick it off with some introductions, and you can put in the chat where you're calling from, what grant you're applying for if you have that in mind already. And then Katie and Carrie will let you introduce yourselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Katie C, the tab lead here with Mid-Atlantic TAB. Thank you all for taking the time to join us.
And I'm Carrie Staten. I'm the director of Mid-Atlantic TAB. All right. You want me to take these? So Mid-Atlantic TAB is your technical assistance provider for all of Region 3. We offer a number of resources, all free of charge, including education on brownfields and support for EPA applications, and that includes today's grant webinar. EPA and DEQ, want to introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'll say hi quick. I'm Brett. I'm EPA Region 3. I'm the Virginia State Lead. Project Officer. I've been in EPA for about 9 years.
And I'm Dawn Farver. I'm also an EPA Region 3 Project Officer. I'm the lead for DC. So if anyone's calling in from DC, welcome. And I'll be helping with this webinar.
Thanks. And I'm Karen Weber. I'm the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality's Brownfields Coordinator.
All right. So this is part 2 of an ongoing series in our EPA grant webinar and education. So part 1 we held in the spring, which was an overview of how to get your brownfield project funded. It talks a lot more about the details of the grant application, including the threshold, the narrative, and the meeting requirements for cleanup grants, as well as eligible activities. You can find the recording and the slides for that on our TAB website, and there's a link in this set of slides, which you will be getting at in the next week. And then we're going to talk a little more about the updates and the timeline now that we have real guidelines for this year. So today we're going to start with an overview of the grants and the eligibility for each type of grant this cycle. We'll talk about cm.gov and the threshold criteria. We're going to highlight, like I said, some changes to this year's guidelines, talk about what's in that grant package, highlight the key information that you need to know, and then we'll talk about TAB resources and questions. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any time, and we will answer them where we can, answer them live as we can, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions as well. And with that, I think I will hand it over to EPA.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. Appreciate it. So yeah, I'll be talking to everyone today about just some of our grant overview, kind of what we're offering and what those offerings look like and how much money. And then we'll kind of take it from there. So this year we're offering what we call MAC grants, multi-purpose assessment and cleanup. And so what's specific about this round is that multi-purpose is offered. So basically what we've been doing the past 4 or 5 years is switching back and forth every year between revolving loan funds and multi-purpose, which I like these years more because I'm the revolving loan fund lead, so I don't have to review the RLF grants this year, so that'll be nice. But we'll talk a little bit more about what those grants look like in the next couple slides. So our timeline this year has definitely gotten a little delayed. If anyone's used to applying to these in the past, usually our solicitation goes out in November, kind of grants are due, or it kind of goes out in September, grants are due in November, and then it kind of moves along from there. But luckily for everyone, it looks like the timeline's remaining somewhat similar. It's just our EPA review times are getting a little shortened. So, our selection announcements should still be happening in June, which is kind of normal and par for the course. So it's really just a delay kind of in the application and solicitation kind of offering. So that's what we're going to try and stick with. There's always delays that could happen, especially in these kind of unpredictable years a little bit. So we'll see. But yeah, for now, January 28th is the big date to remember. That's when your applications are due. So this is what our eligibility looks like for anyone wanting to apply for an EPA Brownfields grant. This hasn't really changed in recent years. It's all, nonprofits and states and local tribal governments, any kind of regional councils or, municipalities. I will say 501c4 organizations, which is a type of nonprofit that lobby, are not eligible for brownfields grants. So that's like one of our specific ones that would not be eligible. And obviously on here, you don't see anything that says private entities are eligible. So if you're a private entity looking for EPA brownfields funds, this might not be the program for you. So this is our rough guideline of what our grants are going to look like this year nationally. So you could see our estimated number of awards kind of in that middle column there. That's about how many awards we're going to offer, throughout the 10 regions. And I'd say Region 3 usually gets about, a tenth of those. So oftentimes they're a little bit cautious on the estimates. Sometimes they're a little bit, we offer a little more just for lower funding. Because as you can see, some of these maximum amounts per grant are pretty massive this year. That cleanup grant at $4 million, I think, has been the biggest I've ever seen it. And there's going to be 26 of those nationally, which is a huge amount of money just for that cleanup program. When I started a couple of years ago, it was like $200,000 a cleanup grant. So it's really changed a lot with spill funding that we're able to offer such large amounts. So that's definitely something to hone in on. And then, obviously we're offering our community-wide assessment, 70 of those nationally. Those are probably our most common grants that we distribute across the regions. Um, so that's definitely a common one. And then the multi-purpose up there. And then obviously you can see here the maximum project period says 5 years or 4 years. Those are pretty long project periods for our grant types. So with the increased amount of money, you obviously have an increased amount of time to spend that money. So it's good to kind of keep that in mind. And that's not set in stone. You could always try to shorten that or elongate that a little bit, but just something to keep in mind. So this chart is kind of just a fancy chart to show what you could apply for in one typical round of funding. So most of the time you can apply for two different grants for brownfields of different types. However, if you want to apply for a cleanup grant and an assessment grant, you can do that. You can see in those three green columns there, you'd apply for both assessment and cleanup. That's kind of like the one exception. Most of the other stuff, if you're trying to apply for two different assessment grants or an assessment coalition grant and community-wide assessment, that's not going to work. So just refer to this chart if you want to apply for multiple grants. And then this chart shows something similar, but it's about whether you have an existing grant. So if you have an existing grant with us with EPA Brownfields, I know I saw a couple people on the chat that I have existing grants with. You have to make sure you either draw down a certain amount of funding or you might not be eligible at all. So just make sure you're looking at what you have to draw down and kind of get set up for applying for a new grant. And back to Tab for these.
All right, thanks, Brett. So we're going to talk a little bit about SAM.gov. I just went the wrong way. Okay, so SAM.gov is the system for award management through the U.S. government. So the EPA they are not the ones in control of this. It is, again, a federal program. So it's really important that you go ahead and check your registration. You may already be registered for this. It may not be you, it may be someone else within your organization. So you want to figure out who that is, check the status of that, check that name, make sure it's the current person. Check out check out how they are receiving the correspondence, the phone number, check out the address, just check it all out. If you are not registered, you've absolutely got to go ahead and get this done. It can take up to 2 weeks for your registration to be complete, but also if you need to make changes, that can also take 2 weeks as well. It is a little bit of a quirky system. So again, it's out of the hands of here with us at TAB or EPA. So it's just really important that you give this the due diligence and time that it deserves. So I know that, it sounds like I'm being over dramatic about that, but we have seen it throw a wrench in folks in their plans and their timelines. So be sure to check that out. This is showing you a bit about how to get it started. So again, SAM.gov, check that out. And the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, was released through grants.gov. That's also where you're going to apply for the actual grant as well. So make sure that that is up to date too. So if you have any questions about this, please reach out to us. As Carrie, our director, likes to say, never fall for something where someone is offering to help you with SAM.gov for a fee. It's not necessary. Don't do it, actually. Please reach out to us. We would be happy to help you with this. And this information provides you with what you need to actually register and check the status of SAM.gov. Carrie is a big fan of making sure that everyone is squared away with SAM.gov. So don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any questions. And when I do talk about renewing your SAM.gov status, that does need to be done once a year. So again, it's not a one and done thing that you sign up for and don't have to check in on. You actually do have to check on it once a year. So be sure to do that. And I'm going to hand it back to the EPA.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Those are some good tips for SAM.gov. There's always issues with that, and never like to wait till the last minute for that one. So yeah, this is a little slide about procurement warning. This is just to say that if you have a QEP helping you develop the grant application, you have to make sure you're going through the competitive bid process. I mean, regardless of if they're helping you or not, you always have to go through the competitive bid process for an EPA grant to make sure that you are meeting our guidelines and our kind of laws and regulations. So if there's a QEP helping you write the grant application and you're planning to award them the grant contract, you can't do that unless they actually go through the competitive bid process and you have to select them fairly. So just make sure you're looking into that and don't cause any kind of preferences in your contractor selection. So now I'm going to talk about what's called threshold criteria, and this is basically a pass-fail system at EPA. It's showing that you are eligible and your site is eligible and your projects are eligible for EPA Brownfields Grant. So it's just a kind of a whole long checklist, that EPA will go through before we even get to your application. So we're not going to give you any kind of review or any kind of score unless you actually pass our threshold criteria. So next slide. Oh, if you do have an issue with threshold, we will notify you within 15 calendar days of you submitting the application. That's a good one to note. So if you do have an issue, we'll let you know that pretty immediately, so you're not sitting there stressing out about if you're going to get selected or not. So for our threshold criteria, for our assessment grants and our cleanup grants, you'll need a letter from the state agency. Actually, I think for all of our grants, you need a letter from the state agency. So for a multi-purpose grant, you would need that as well. And Karen from VADEQ will talk about that a little bit more detailed later, but just make sure you don't include just copy and paste a previous year's application from the letter or from the state. You want to make sure that you're actually submitting it to the state every year with each new application. So you can't just copy and paste the previous year for that. And then for a cleanup grant, the letters have to be a little bit more specific. When you come in for a cleanup grant, you need to actually show that the site is kind of ready to go and characterized, and phase 2 has been completed on it, and that VADEQ is on board with how this site's been characterized, that they are saying, yeah, you're good to go, and that there's been a sufficient level for you to start that cleanup. So just make sure that you're kind of getting those details from Karen and Virginia. But like I said, she'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later. And yeah, if you could see on that last slide, there's a little date there that says June 15th. That's kind of the date you would need. Sorry, I'm throwing tab for a whack because I'm making the pauses and then keep going back. But yeah, it has to be completed by June 15th, 2026. That statement that your characterization would be complete by June 15th. You would need to include that information when you send that in for the state review. Sorry, thank you. All right, so our other eligibility kind of criteria for cleanup grants is that you have to have own the site at the time of the application. So you can't, just have site access or something simple. You actually need to be the property owners for the site. And on top of that, you need to have acquired the site through, a liability protection. So that's what we have in that second bullet there, AAI. It's called All Appropriate Inquiries. And that's basically to make sure that EPA doesn't deem you as potentially liable for contaminating the property that you own. So what that means is prior to purchasing the property, you as the entity need to have done a phase 1 environmental site assessment on the property um, to show what the contamination kind of looked like prior to acquiring the property. So this is probably the number one way that we see cleanup applicants fail threshold criteria at EPA. There's always issues with the CERCLA liability is what we call it. So just make sure if you do come in with a site in mind that you have done what we call our due diligence or our all appropriate inquiry and made sure that you have protections against CERCLA when you come in for an EPA grant for cleanup grants. And there's some parts of the liability that have to be updated within 180 days prior to purchasing the property. So just keep that timeline in mind when you do purchase the property. There are some exceptions to this, such as, if you have the property prior to 2002, when this law was enacted, then that's kind of like grandfathered into the program. So there are some ways to get around it, but obviously we're going to go through our attorneys with this and make sure that, it's really looked at in detail. So if you have questions, you could reach out to me about that one. Some other additions for the threshold criteria for cleanup grants are community notifications and public meetings. So these are just ways that you have to show that you're letting the public know about the project. So for public meetings, you have to show the application and kind of talk about it. It doesn't have to be necessarily a public meeting specifically for the cleanup grant application. It could be added on to any other kind of public meeting you have. And it could be in person or virtual. So if you have a regularly scheduled virtual meeting that you offer to the community, you can just add kind of an agenda item that you have this cleanup grant, kind of select and check that box for the program. And then yeah, it has a whole list of the attachments. There's a really good handout that TAB has, and it's part of the guidelines as well that you could kind of look at all these checklists and kind of make sure you're checking all the boxes. And the community notification part of that is kind of similar. Basically, you just have to show the public what you're working on. So, it says in a local newspaper, I don't know if anyone actually looks at local newspapers anymore, but you could do, a web page or social media or some other kind of means that you reach out to your communities and kind of show them what the grant application is, what your APCA is, attach all the documents and let them actually comment on it, and you could respond to their comments. Just kind of let the community know in a viable manner. So like I said, TAB has some really good handouts on this. This is for a cleanup grant. It kind of gets into detail about all that CERCLA liability and some of the other issues that you might face facing threshold criteria for cleanup grants. And on the next slide, they also have one for assessment grants. So I'm sure they'll send out the slides after this presentation to everybody, and you could kind of click on these links and kind of check out the infographics that they put together for us. All right, and with that, I'm going to pass it on to Dawn to talk about some of the changes we've had this year.
Hey everyone. So I'm going to talk with you all a little bit about some of the MAC grant changes that are different from 2025 for the assessment and cleanup and from 2024 for the multi-purpose grants. The main thing that you want to take away from this presentation, even if you ignore everything I say, is that there is a link to where all of the changes are on the FY26 Notice of Funding Opportunities and Guidelines. So when the slides go out, you'll have this link to go and look at the changes. So if you forget anything I say or have any additional questions, that's a really good place to check for a comprehensive list. Okay, so let's start going through all the grants. So if you've looked at guidelines previously for grants, we have a new streamlined Notice of Funding Opportunities template. And so I actually really like it. It's a little bit better. We don't have quite as many I's as we did previously. So it's a really, I think the format's a little bit better. There's also, you also need to review the updated language and requirements to align with our current priorities of our administration. Do check to see if things ended up, oh, sorry, Katie. Do check to see if things ended up in a different section than previous applications. We always, always, always recommend that you read the new guidelines. And if you've submitted an application before, you make sure that everything's in the right location and matches up with the current guidelines, because there are always changes. And if we get applications that meet a previous guideline, they may not meet the current guidelines. And so it may be hard to get as good of a score as you could. And then also in section 2A, there's clarification on how nonprofit organizations exempt from taxation under the 501c4 program may be eligible to apply. They also include a sample format for your budget table. It never hurts to use those tables that are provided in the guidelines, because then we have more consistency in those applications. And on every page of this slide deck, there is that link to the changes. So make sure that you use that. And now we'll talk a little bit more about some of these specific grants. Okay, so community-wide assessment grants are the first that we're going to talk about. If you saw those tables, or we call them the eligibility charts that Brett spoke about, that talk about if you have a current grant, what can you apply for? Those are going to be really, really helpful to you. And I'm going to talk a lot about what's in those tables, but make sure that you go back and reference those. So they'll be in the slide deck, and they also are available on the EPA website. So entities with an open community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes. So we call those CWAG street grants. And again, specific to states and tribes. They can apply for another CWAG street grant as long as they've drawn down 60% of all of their current CWAG street grants. For current assessment and multi-purpose grant recipients, if you want to apply for a community-wide assessment grant funding, you must have met a 70% drawdown requirement by the October 1st, 2025 deadline to apply for the grant. So again, check those eligibility charts. Those are super helpful to understand where you are, but you will have had to meet all of those drawdown requirements by October 1st. We also have a breakdown for each of these on what the percent distribution is of points throughout the application, but I will recommend that you answer every single question, try to put things in the section they're requested. And if you have something that doesn't apply to you, or for example, you don't have the information for your community related, at least put a note in there that you looked for the information and it wasn't available, and what information you used instead, or list that it's not applicable. That way it doesn't look like you have a gap in your application. You're just making it clear that you did the research, but that information wasn't available, or why it wasn't applicable to your organization or project. Okay, so for assessment coalition grants, there are awards available up to $1.5 million. Again, Brett went through the chart that says what our estimated funding is going to be and how many different grants are going to be awarded under each category. I think it's important to note that where we're giving out more awards, you may have a better chance of getting one if you have the information and you're interested in that particular program. Entities with an open award or pending award for a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes are not eligible to apply for assessment grant funding. So again, back to the eligibility chart. In the past, there were limitations on which entities were eligible to lead assessment coalition grants. So some of those limitations have been removed. So please review that information, because these eligibility will apply for the same for both lead and non-lead coalition members. It had been different in the past. Current assessment and multi-purpose grant recipients that want to apply for funding under an assessment coalition grant must have met the 70% drawdown requirement by October 1st, 2025. In addition, related to target areas that are presented in the coalition grant applications, those areas may not overlap, and they must be in at least 3 distinct municipalities or jurisdictions. So it can be 3 towns, it can be 3 cities, or 3 tribes. And again, we have that breakdown of point percentage distribution just to sort of keep in mind how many points each of the sections are worth. But again, make sure that you address all the questions to get the most points possible. Okay, and now we'll talk a little bit about multi-purpose grants and what some of those changes are. So again, if you have an open award or pending award for a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes, you're not eligible to apply for multi-purpose grant funding under the solicitation. But if you have an assessment or multi-purpose grant right now that you want to apply for funding, you just have to have met that 70% drawdown requirement. again, point percentage distribution. You can see that for some of these, the maximum number of points available can be higher or lower. Those change year to year, but this is kind of a good thing to check just as you're filling out your application to make sure you're weighting your responses properly. And cleanup grants. Okay, so this is a key thing that Brett already spoke about a little bit, but it is a change that you'll want to note. So your state, the letter coming from the state, if you are interested in applying for a cleanup grant, once you give them all of the information that they need to be able to send you that letter, they're either going to note that your site is sufficiently characterized and you're ready for remediation, or they're going to note that it hasn't been sufficiently characterized yet. If it has not been sufficiently characterized yet, as the applicant, you will need to affirm that a sufficient level of characterization or assessment will be performed by June 15th, 2026, and that at that point you'll allow for the remediation work to begin. So in the past, we haven't had that additional attestation from the grantee saying that yes, additional assessments needed and it will be performed by this date. It had been it had in there that it was required that if you did additional assessment, it had to be completed by that date, but it got a little bit lost in the wash. So this way we have your applicants actually attest that it will be completed by that date. So make sure that if your state letter says you need more assessment before remediation can happen, that you have a statement somewhere that says, yes, more assessment needs to occur. It will be completed by this date. Okay, so back to this, who's eligible. If you currently have a multi-purpose grant and you want to apply for a cleanup grant, you must meet the 70% drawdown requirement by that October 1st, 2025 deadline. And again, you can see the breakdown and the maximum number of points for cleanup grants this year. Okay, so I'll take a quick pause and see if anyone has any questions. You're welcome to type them into the chat. We can respond to them there. I think you can also raise your hand and we can call on you. And we'll also be available at the end of the presentation if anyone has questions. So I'll wait just a second, see if anyone has any questions. Okay. If not, I'm going to hand it off to Karen Weber with Virginia DEQ to talk about the grant package.
Hello, thanks everyone. We want to make sure that we're setting everyone up for a successful application, and just wanted to go over some of the components that are required for the grant application so that you are not overlooking something that is simple that could result in a ding or a lower score and the grant not being awarded. One of the key pieces is to make sure you stay within the allowable page count, that you don't go over, because they will only what's within the page count is what will be reviewed and read, and to make sure that content is put where it's asked. This comes up a lot, and I hear the TAB folks say it a lot. Even if the flow of the information fits somewhere else, but a component is asked for under a certain question, put it under that question. It may not flow, but that's where the points will be received. And even if it's in the application, but it's in the wrong spot, you will not get credit for it. And that has been a ding on some applications that didn't get awarded before and has come up in feedback. Make sure you have your target areas and priority site information thought out for those that are on the cobweb. I've asked for some of that information. This applies to multiple grant application types. Making sure that you're following the content for the grant application you're applying for, following those checklists, and making sure that the content for your cleanup grant is correct for the cleanup grant versus an assessment grant. Next slide. Content here, is pretty typical. Having yours, following the single space, don't exceed the page limit, don't, follow the narrative, the project description, and the community needs as they're presented, as they're asked for in the size, the amount of space that they give you. Make sure you meet your threshold criteria responses. As Brett mentioned, that's kind of a pass-fail situation. If there are items that they say you can add on, such as a map or something that doesn't count in your page count, and you have an opportunity to add that on, go ahead and add it. Don't fret it, but make sure that it does say that it's allowable and won't count against your page count. Next slide. And this is where I come in, your letter from the state agency. So grant applications are required to coordinate with the Virginia DEQ and Brownfields team. We find these really useful for us as well. It gives us an awareness of what communities are applying for these grants so that we can also assist and maybe find supportive. Yes.
Karen, you froze. Can you back up a couple sentences? Because I think we can hear you now.
You're having trouble hearing me?
Yeah, actually, if you could turn your video off, that should help with the
Okay.
connection.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I will talk louder and see if that helps. I apologize. Zoom doesn't seem to work very well on our system. We were talking about letters from the state agencies, a required component. Coordinate those with us at DEQ. We want to be aware of the grant applications that are being submitted. When you're doing an assessment grant or a coalition grant, sharing the target areas and priority sites with us is also really valuable. We may have information or knowledge about those sites. We would like to personalize these in some way, but also that helps us to confirm support for them. As it mentioned, if you submitted last year and were not awarded and you're resubmitting, we do need to do a new letter. That can just come to me as an email. Send an email to me at the email address there, karen.weber@deq.virginia.gov. That just includes the content, the information that's being, the type of grant. In the header and the subject line, please note that this is a community support letter for an EPA assessment grant or a cleanup grant letter. And we will process that. I will acknowledge it. We'll process it if we have any questions, and we will get that to you ahead of your application. And go to the next slide. So there are not multi-purpose grants this round. So this is cleanup. Then again, assessment and coalition grants fall under the community support grant. For the cleanup grants, we do have a little more effort that's needed, where we will actually run the site through a kind of a faux eligibility review with our voluntary remediation program. And that supports that the site is eligible to be enrolled in the program when the grant is awarded and the remedial efforts are started. It is my understanding that it's not necessarily required, but for the most part, we would certainly encourage enrollment in VRP during that process to provide that additional technical oversight. It's not required if it's an asbestos cleanup, because we would not generally enroll a site in the VRP for asbestos cleanup. So that's one component where we might say it's not eligible or it would not need to be enrolled in the voluntary remediation program. To do that, we will send it to our regional offices for our typical eligibility review as if you were applying for VRP. So we do ask for a little bit of extra time to account for that. We will do everything in our power to fast track that. If something comes in late or it's getting close to the end, we will do our best to get that information back out to you so that you have the letter to include with your initial submittal. Next slide. Before we go to the key information, I do want to reiterate, follow the instructions when you're working on your application. After you write something, go back and review what the guidelines say. Make sure that you are truly answering the questions in the way that it is asked with the content that they are expecting to see, so that you don't overlook something. I've said in the past, it's like putting together a piece of IKEA furniture. You can try to do it without following the instructions, but your chair might fall apart when you sit in it. It might not, but it's risky. So follow those instructions, follow the guidelines, and you should set yourself up for a successful application. And I'm done. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the federal forms that everyone's going to need to submit. These are all outlined in the guidelines, so they'll have a list of them for you. If you've applied before, you're familiar with these. So the first is the application for federal assistance, which is the SF424 form. You also need to include your budget information for non-construction programs on the SF424A. You'll need to provide a key contacts form, which is form 5700-54. You will also need to complete a pre-award compliance review report. We have additional information at that link on how to fill that out. And then you'll need that project narrative attachment form. So that summary of your information, of that narrative information sheet. To assist with completing these, there's a sample federal forms link that you can click on that has some information on what you need to put in those fields. But one of the things I want to make sure I highlighted is that at the very bottom in that pink purpley text, that the EPA has a website that has a list of forms. You want to make sure that when you submit these forms, you're using the most current version possible. If you go to that website and download whatever forms there, that will be the most current version. We don't want you to end up submitting an old version that doesn't have all the information we're requesting and then have that be an issue for you in your threshold review or in your review of your application. So please make sure you get the most current version of each of these forms that's required. Please submit all the forms that are required for your application as outlined in the guidelines. Also, if you have applied previously for a grant and you were unsuccessful, make sure that you do, if you've been through the process, doing a grant debrief can be very helpful, where people will sit down with you and go through what was good about your application and where maybe some improvement could be needed. So go back and refer to that if you've done a grant debrief to make sure that you incorporate those changes in your next version of your application. And when in doubt, always check the frequently asked questions. These are super helpful. They're going to give a lot of information that's really detailed. We're not talking about just 5 little questions that they have in there. They have a lot of detail about different types of applications, about completing your budget, about all kinds of things that you may need as you're completing your application. So make sure that no matter what, you're familiar with those FAQs, you go through and review those that are applicable to the application you're submitting. And just read through, because I think that can be really helpful. It can also guide questions that you may have if you want to reach out to TAB and get additional assistance. You can say, okay, I was looking at the FAQs and this information's in there. What do I need to do to meet those criteria? We also have other resources, including slides and recordings of webinars, where we're talking about these changes to the NOFO, where we're giving you additional assistance on the MARC Grant Resources page. So again, when you get these slides, you can access all of these links to get this information. Okay, another question spot. I guess I get all the questions. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we can address those for you, or raise your hand if you have a specific question now. And otherwise, I'm going to hand this, I think, back over to Tab.
Yes, but before Katie talks about stuff, I'm going to launch our post-webinar poll for people to fill out while Katie tells you about some of the resources and how TAB can assist with your application process.
All right. Thanks, Dawn and Becca. So there are many ways that we here at TAB can help you. The general ways that we can help you all throughout the year includes brownfield education. That includes webinars such as today's topic about preparing for the EPA Brownfield Grant application. We also host different events. I know Becca is working hard with Karen to actually prepare for the summer Virginia Brownfield Conference. Be sure to save the date. That's in June. Yeah, in Stanton. So again, another opportunity to learn about a variety of brownfield information. So we can also provide assistance with brownfield identification. So if for folks who are new to the brownfield world, we are happy to help, new to the brownfield world would be education, resource identification. That includes grant writing assistance. We cannot write the grant for you, but we can provide that assistance as you are writing the grant. We're happy to be another set of eyes. We're happy to help you if you're having some trouble pulling data, which has certainly been tricky lately. And also, again, throughout the year, we can help with some resources such as preparing resource roadmaps if you have a project that's a little bit further down the road. We can also provide local brownfield program support. So if you believe you have brownfields in your community, but you're not quite sure where or how many, we can help you with identifying those. And so you can have your own brownfield inventory and start from there so that you know how to even begin to work and address those. We can answer questions that are specific to sites or just brownfields in general. And we're always here for technical support. We also have the ability to help with project development and design assistance. Shout out to Elizabeth with the Virginia Tech Design Assistance Center. Her team is a great way that our team can help with being able to provide some great landscape architecture design and help you go through the visioning process. So if you have questions for any of that, please, reach out to us. But for today's purpose, to help you get ready for the grant, we want to make sure you are mindful of deadlines. So if you would like Mid-Atlantic TAB to provide some review of your grant, please send that deadline. The deadline to send your draft copy to us is January 16th. It is our goal. Well, we will absolutely make sure that we get through one review of it. There are situations where sometimes folks get it back to us in time, and with our workload, we have the opportunity to provide a second review once they've done some revisions. So sometimes that works out, but just please feel free to reach out to any of us here on the team, and we'd be happy to do that. Deadline to get your letter request to Karen is January 14th. So be sure to get that to her. As she said, they want to have enough time to be able to really be creative with that letter for you. So that's January 14th. And then, of course, the big deadline is January 28th. Again, make sure you have gone through the troubleshooting process with SAM.gov. You absolutely cannot wait until January 28th or even a little bit before then, again, knowing that it can take some time. So just a reminder for how Karen and Brett can help you as well, if there's anything they would like to add, but Karen and Brett had the really good idea to kind of call out some ways that they can provide support, and that is listed here. Brett and Don are a little more limited right now with the actual NOFO being open, but they are absolutely available to help you with threshold criteria questions. But when you're not applying for a grant, please reach out to Brett and Don and the EPA team because they are fantastic resources. Guys, do you have anything you'd like to add to this?
No, I think you're good.
All right.
Nothing to add. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and so you've got their email addresses here if you would like to have that. If you need that to be able to reach out to them, because again, the slides will be provided to you. And again, we here at TAB can provide assistance with almost anything, except we cannot write that grant. We can help you with again, reviewing it or brainstorming for, your narrative, what you want to focus on. Happy to help with that. So, and again, we're here for things other than grants too. This is how you can stay connected with us. We have a phone number you can contact us. Our our email address. If you click on the link there, you can actually just choose a time that works according to our calendars. And then please stay up to date on the newsletter. Becca and the team do a wonderful job making sure they're trying to find all the information to help you stay on top of everything. And I believe the links below and other resources are accurate. If you find that they're not, let us know. We should be updating that. But we wish everyone luck. And be sure to take a little bit of time to, celebrate the holidays too.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all so much for participating